Thank you, Shirley, and thank you, everyone. And thank you to the congregation for inviting me. And greetings from Canada, where COVID is exploding. We are not doing very well with regard to that. So when I heard at the beginning of discussion, people were really hoping for some good news. I'm afraid my talk today is not on a cheerful topic. I thank you for inviting me to speak to you about the work of my mother, who is a Yiddish language novelist, Chava Rosenfarb. Yesterday, April 15th, was the 71st anniversary of my mother's liberation from Bergen-Belsen by the British Army. And Monday, April 19th, as I'm sure you know, will be the 78th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. So this is a significant time of year for me. As a child and later as an adult, I always accompanied my mother to Holocaust memorial events in Montreal and in Toronto, where she was frequently invited to speak. And when she spoke, there was silence in the hall, punctuated really only by sniffles and the occasional sob, which grew more and more frequent as her talk progressed. She spoke in Yiddish, and her words moved people to tears, not least because she was a Holocaust survivor herself, and her words resonated with authenticity. Chava Rosenfarb was a writer of the past, of her own past, and that of the Jews of Poland. For her, the past meant specifically Jewish, Yiddish-speaking Poland, the Poland that she saw disappear before her eyes during the 4 long years that she spent in the Lodz Ghetto and the final year in the concentration camps. She was a writer with a mission. That mission was to recreate the lost world of Polish Jewry in her novels, to chronicle and memorialize a community that no longer existed because it had been annihilated. All 3 of Chava's novels, The Tree of Life, Bochani, and Letters to Abrasha, are set in Poland, the country of her birth, and specifically in the city of Lodz, her hometown. Like the Holocaust survivor in one of Chava's Montreal-based short stories, who, when he's asked why he left Poland, says, "I am still there." My mother, in her imagination, remained in Poland. She was still there. Not only are all of her novels set in Poland, but they all deal with the Holocaust in one way or another. Since Chava wrote a great deal, short stories, essays, poetry, and the 3 novels, I can only give you a brief taste of her work in this lecture, but I hope it will be enough to interest you to know more and to read her work for yourselves. But before I turn to her work, I would like to tell you a little about the writer. Chava Rosenfarb was born in Lodz, Poland in 1923, the elder of 2 daughters of Avram Rosenfarb, a restaurant waiter. Lodz was at the time the 2nd largest city in Poland after Warsaw. Her mother worked in a textile factory as a stopperke, which means someone who mends faults in fabric. Both of Chava's parents originally came from the small town of Końsk. As you can see on the map, this is Lodz. There's Warsaw, and Końsk was just a little bit northeast of Krakow. The father's side of the family traced its descent from Reb Yonason Eibushitz, a famous rabbi who had opposed the false messiah Shabtai Tzvi in the 17th century, while secretly being one of his followers. Chava was very proud of the fact that she descended from a famous rabbi because it gave her yichus. Chava's parents both migrated from the town of Końsk to Lodz to find work in the factories of the great industrial city. There they married, and Chava and her younger sister were both born in Lodz. Her father began his working life as a weaver in a factory, but because he was an unusually good-looking man, or so my mother said, He landed a job as a waiter in a restaurant that catered to a literary and political clientele. And this was his job when Chava, his first child, was born. She later published a fictional account of the early lives and courtship of both her parents in the novels Bochani and of Lodz and Love. Chava's parents were active in the Jewish Socialist Bund, the secular left-leaning Jewish political movement that had an enormous following among working-class Jews in Eastern Europe. In the period between the two world wars, the Bund was a major cultural and political force in Poland, where it elected representatives to the city council in the larger cities. Bundist ideology encouraged agitation for equal rights for Jews in Poland, where there was rampant anti-Semitism with restrictions on Jews in higher education and the professions. The Bund also incorporated a strong cultural element that privileged Yiddish as the language of the Jewish masses. So Chava and her sister were educated in Yiddish at a Bundist school. One of the other students at this school was Heinrich Morgentaler, the son of Joseph Morgentaler, a Bundist representative to the city council of Lodz. Chava married Heinrich Morgentaler after the war in Belgium. When they emigrated to Canada in 1950, he changed his name to Henry and became famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, in Canada as a crusader for abortion rights. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To return to Chava. While her elementary school education had been in Yiddish, her high school education was in Polish. She attended the school for 5 years, both before and after the outbreak of the war. By the time she graduated, she was already incarcerated in the Lodz Ghetto. While still a child, Chava had shown a talent for writing, producing countless poems, which her father proudly showed off to the patrons of the restaurant where he worked. She later claimed that she became a writer on the day that she first learned to hold a pencil in her hand. But she became a Holocaust writer on February 8th, 1940, the day before her 17th birthday, when she, her family, and the entire Jewish population of Lodz were herded into a ghetto. There she wrote, "The nightmare of my early life began in earnest." And it is this nightmare of incarceration in the Lodz Ghetto that became the subject of her 3-volume novel, The Tree of Life. The Nazis established the ghetto in 1940, herding the Jews into one of the city's slums called Baluti, which they encircled with barbed wire. So this is a picture of the Lodz Ghetto and primarily of the bridge in the Lodz Ghetto, which connected. The ghetto was on 2 sides of this bridge. Beneath the bridge is Lodz itself, is a busy street, as you can see. And Jews had to cross over this wooden bridge to get from one side of the ghetto to the other. Nazi soldiers stood underneath, as you can see here. And if they felt like it, they just fired into the people crossing the bridge. It's hard to imagine what a horrific experience that must have been. Chava's family was housed in a tiny apartment with only a kitchen and a bedroom in the ghetto. She and her sister slept in the kitchen on chairs and a sofa. It was from this bed of chairs that she would rise every morning at dawn to write poems before going to work at her various ghetto jobs. Some of the inhabitants of the ghetto. Her poetry brought Chava to the attention of Simcha Bunim Shayevich, the great ghetto poet and the author of an epic poem called Lech Lecha. She became Shayevich's protege, and it was he who introduced her to the writers group of the Lodz Ghetto, who quickly recognized her talent and accepted her at age 17 as their youngest member. When the ghetto was liquidated in August 1944, Chava and her family were deported to Auschwitz. There, she was separated from her father, whom she never saw again. From Auschwitz, Chava, her sister, and mother were transported to a forced labor camp at Zazel on the outskirts of Hamburg, where they built houses for the bombed out Germans of that city. As the Allies approached, Chava, her mother, and sister were again transported, this time to Bergen-Belsen, where they were liberated by the British Army in April 1945. In 1950, she emigrated to Canada and settled in Montreal. Given her experiences during the war, it is not surprising that the Holocaust hovers over Chava's work like a malignant shadow. In fact, the genesis of her most famous novel, The Tree of Life, began at Auschwitz. Here is Chava's description. When we disembarked at Auschwitz, I stood on the station platform with my knapsack on my back, one arm embracing my father. I held a bundle of poems that I'd written in the ghetto under the other arm. A capo tore the bundle from my arm and tossed it onto a heap of discarded prayer books, letters, and photographs. The men were separated from the women, and my father was ordered to join the columns of men. That was the last I ever saw of him. Then came the selection. My mother, my sister, and I were sent off through the gate with the inscription Arbeit macht frei. Soon I stood naked with my head shaved, but my life spared. It was then that the thought of one day writing a book about the Lodz Ghetto, that is, if I survived, flickered for a moment across my mind. In fact, it was not until Chava was settled in Brussels immediately after the war that work on the novel began. At the same time, she was writing poetry, and her first published books were collections of poems. Between 1947 and 1965, she published 4 volumes of poetry in Yiddish, and this is one of her last poems. She also wrote plays, and by lucky coincidence, as Shirley mentioned, her play, The Bird of the Ghetto, will be performed in an online production by the Volksbühne starting this Sunday. The play has been performed before in Hebrew and in English translation, but this marks the first time it will be staged in Yiddish, the language in which it was written, although there will be English subtitles. Feeling that neither poetry nor drama could adequately express everything she wanted to say about her experiences during the Holocaust, beginning in the early 1950s, Chava began concentrating her literary energies on writing the 3-volume novel, The Tree of Life, which was finally published in Yiddish in 1972. The Tree of Life is a massive 3-volume work that chronicles the annihilation of the Jews of Lodz. Because the subject is so vast, the structure of the novel, its breadth and scope are vast as well. The Tree of Life is in fact an epic, a chronicle of the destruction of the second largest Jewish community in the world before the war, numbering over 200,000 souls. Only Warsaw had more Jews. That this community was also intimately known to the author who had been one of its members lends both an urgency and an authenticity to the novel. The Tree of Life presents in unflinching, precise, and often horrific detail the inner workings of the ghetto, the daily frustrations and humiliations of ghetto life. It chronicles the barbarous cruelty of the Nazis, the constant hunger of the inhabitants, barely relieved by concoctions made from turnips and potato peels. It chronicles torture, betrayal, and degradation. But it also documents the tenderness of human love despite these conditions. It illuminates the complexities of relationships between husbands and wives, parents and children, lovers and friends. It documents the political life of the ghetto, and it describes the cultural life of the ghetto, the establishment of a library in a 2-room flat, attendance at concerts and plays, meetings of the writers' group, political agitation and resistance. Most importantly, it peoples the ghetto with complex human beings whose individual stories make for compelling reading. In short, the Tree of Life provides as complete and authentic a portrait of what it was like to have lived and died in the Lodz Ghetto as literature can. And in this way, it also demonstrates the extent to which fiction can both transcend and animate history. If you want to know what life was like in the Lodz Ghetto from 1940 to 1944, then you should read The Tree of Life. It took Chava 22 years to write The Tree of Life, which she began shortly after settling in Montreal in 1950. By this time, she was already a well-known poet in Yiddish language literary circles. This is her book of poems translated into English. Chava spent 50 years of her life in Montreal, a city where Yiddish had once been the most widely spoken language after French and English. There she continued to write in Yiddish, the language in which she published 2 more novels, Bochani and Letters to a Brasha. She was also a frequent contributor to Avram Sutzkever's prestigious Yiddish language literary journal, The Goldene Kite, where in the early 1980s, she began to publish a series of short stories about the lives of Holocaust survivors in Canada. Unlike her novels, which are massive in scale and set solely in Poland before and during the Second World War, the short stories are set in Canada in the 1960s and 70s. For instance, the short story A Friday in the Life of Sarah Zonnebend describes a typical Friday in the life of an ordinary Canadian housewife, except that this housewife is a Holocaust survivor. Nothing much happens in the story, although the events of that day are conveyed in minute detail. Sarah Zonnebend seems to be suffering from the common malaise of unemployed middle-class housewives from the era before women's liberation. She has a husband who is indifferent to her, adolescent children too busy with their own lives to pay attention to her, and days too full of nothing meaningful to do. The story ends with Sarah's confiding to her diary, "Today is Friday, and thank heaven, nothing happened." It is this last line with its telltale "thank heaven" that suggests the drama underlying the lack of event in Sarah's life. She means this line literally, and not, as one might suspect, ironically. As we learn during the course of the short narrative that describes Sarah's day, the most horrific events of her life in the concentration camps all occurred on a Friday. Sarah's uneventful present life in Canada, in which nothing happens, is thus implicitly contrasted with her overly eventful life in Europe, in which too much happened. Another story, Edja's Revenge, which Shirley alluded to, addresses the theme of the persistence of Europe and European memories within the context of a new beginning in Canada. The story is narrated by Rella, a former capo. Capos were Jewish concentration camp inmates whom the Nazis put in charge of their fellow prisoners. Rella, who had become a capo through bestowing sexual favors on a guard, lorded it over the other women in her barracks, beating them and indulging in the petty cruelties which her position permitted. Her one good deed was to save the life of Edja, another camp inmate, by hiding Edja under a bunk during roll call. After the war, Rella and Edja meet again in Montreal, where each has settled unbeknownst to the other. Edja's Revenge chronicles their desperate attempts to come to terms with their past and with each other. Ambivalence about their European roots haunts all the characters in Edja's Revenge, who as a group live dual lives. Outwardly, they, like Sarah Zonneband, adapt very well to their Canadian reality, learning English, making a success of their various business enterprises, participating in the cultural life of their city. But inwardly, as the author makes clear, they have never left the Europe that tortured and rejected them. The truth is, writes Rella, that we felt alien in this new world, that we were so caught up with modernity because we found it so frightening. When Chava died in 2011, she left behind a lot of work untranslated into English, including the novel Letters to Abrasha and almost all of her numerous essays. During her writing career, Chava had written many essays. Of these, there was one in particular that she herself had translated and that she was very anxious to get into print. It was a memoir of and a tribute to the writer Simcha Bunim Shayevich, the poet of the Lodz Ghetto, whom Chava always referred to as her mentor. And this is Shayevich here as a young man. She had first met Shayevich in the Lodz Ghetto. When the ghetto was liquidated in 1944, the remaining inhabitants were deported to Auschwitz. Shayevich was sent to the gas chamber not long afterwards at Kaufering. I don't believe that Chava ever had a notion of publishing all her essays together in one book. At least she never said anything about this. But the essay about Shayevich was dear to her heart. So in the early 1990s, she translated it herself, asked me to edit it for her, and then nothing. She didn't know where to send it for publication. She sent queries to the English language journals and magazines of the time, especially the Jewish ones. But no one wanted to publish it, possibly because the essay was too long to fit into conventional magazine format. More likely because its topic, a poet whom no one had heard of by a writer whom no one had heard of, was too obscure. After Chava's death, I found the English translation of this essay among her papers. I had not read it since the time in 1992 when I had helped her to edit it. I was impressed and I thought, this really ought to be published. I remembered the difficulties that Chava had in publishing the English translation of the Shayevich essay, and I determined that I would try again. I showed the essay to the writer, David Bezmozgis. He suggested that I submit it to the online journal Tablet, and he made the shidduch with the editors. They accepted the essay without hesitation. Buoyed by this success, I sent them another work, the Bergen-Belsen Diary of 1945. The Bergen-Belsen Diary recounts the days that Chava, her mother and sister, spent in the displaced persons camp at Bergen-Belsen right after their liberation. The diary was appended to Chava's very first publication, the poetry collection, Die Ballade von Nächtigen Wald, the Ballad of Yesterday's Forest. While it was based on the diary that Chava actually kept after her liberation from Bergen-Belsen, she had edited and changed it. One of the things she had edited out before its Yiddish publication in 1948 in Montreal was her relationship with a British soldier named Douglas Jensen, who had been with the British Army that liberated the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. They had met at a Yiddish language concert held on the grounds of the Bergen-Belsen camp shortly after the liberation in 1945. Just before the start of the concert, Chava noticed a British soldier sitting in the row in front of her and guessed that he was not Jewish. Afraid that he would not understand what was being said, she tapped him on the shoulder and offered her services as a translator. With that, they became friends. In fact, they became friends for life. Chava sent Douglas copies of all her published works, despite the fact that she knew he could not read Yiddish. When she sent him the Bergen-Belsen diary, Douglas placed an ad in the British press looking for a translator of the text into English. He found one, but this was clearly someone who knew Yiddish better than she knew English. I found this translation among my mother's papers after her death, and I realized immediately that the English text was useless. So I decided to translate the diary myself. It was this translation that Tablet magazine published on Holocaust Memorial Day 2014. Having now had some success with publishing 2 of Chava's nonfiction works in English, I conceived of the idea of a collection of essays. And that was the genesis of the book, Confessions of a Yiddish Writer. This book, incidentally, is available at a discount to listeners of this talk. The essay collection represents the first time that Chava's nonfiction works have been published as a group in English. I would like to pause on one essay in particular. This is the essay on feminism in Yiddish literature. This essay was written around 1990, when feminism was very much in the news, but had not yet been applied to Yiddish literature in any kind of systematic way. The conference at the Jewish Theological Seminary, at which Chava first read her essay, was one of the first attempts to focus a critical lens on Yiddish and Hebrew literature from a feminist perspective. The reason that such a perspective had taken so long to take hold in the field of Jewish studies is alluded to in the essay, namely that given the endangered state of Jews in Eastern Europe, the pogroms, persecutions, everyday slights and abuses, Yiddish literary women felt uncomfortable making too much of their feminism when the greater danger of violence hovered over all Jews, and later when Yiddish literature itself faced oblivion. Chava was always aware of the kinds of problems women writers encountered. She herself suffered from sexism, and some of the comments about her work that appeared in the Jewish press are instructive. For instance, when her play, The Bird of the Ghetto, was being presented for performance by the Habima, Israel's national theater, the local Montreal Jewish paper, and this is the Yiddish paper, wrote, and I quote, "The wife of a Montreal Jewish doctor and the mother of growing children, one of the highly regarded poets in Yiddish literature, has had her drama, The Bird of the Ghetto, accepted for presentation by Israel's National Theater, the Habima." That's the end of the quote. You will notice that the hierarchy of importance goes from her being the wife of a doctor, then the mother of growing children, and lastly, a highly regarded poet. When the great Yiddish writer Melech Ravitch tried to raise funds for the original Yiddish publication of the Tree of Life, he wrote that the book was written, and I quote, "with an iron-willed self-discipline and Homeric sweep that is amazing in a woman writer. The more so since there is not a single trace of hysteria in the writing." That's the end of the quote. Personally, I've never been able to shake the suspicion that Chava is not better known as a writer about the Holocaust because she was a woman, living and writing at a time when women's work in general was devalued. I would like to end by saying something about Yiddish, the language in which Chava wrote, out of fidelity to the lost community of Jews whose language this was. The Holocaust put an end to many things, but one of its most tragic losses, in my opinion, is the Yiddish language and the rich cultural heritage which it nourished. As time went on, Chava became increasingly aware that night had come into the garden of Yiddish, that Yiddish was fading as a secular and literary language in Montreal and the rest of the world. The awareness of decline may have come gradually, but it was a shock nevertheless. The Yiddish newspaper of Montreal, Der Kenner der Odler, was forced to close for lack of readers. Attendance at Yiddish lectures in Montreal, Toronto, and New York diminished dramatically. For Chava, the greatest blow was the demise of the Goldene Kite, Avrum Sutzkever's respected Yiddish literary journal, to which she had contributed stories, essays, and travelogues for nearly 40 years, and which suddenly ceased publication in 1990. The folding of the Goldene Kite threw her into a profound depression because it meant that she no longer had a venue for publishing what she wrote in Yiddish. So what was the point of even continuing to write in that language? Or what was the point of continuing to write at all? Chava's decision to write The Tree of Life and her other novels in Yiddish had been a fateful one, given that it contributed to the obscurity of the work. Yet it was an unavoidable decision, not only because Yiddish was the author's mother tongue and the language in which she felt most comfortable, but also because of her desire to memorialize the lost Jewish community of Lodz, a community that lived its life in Yiddish. I would like to end then with Chava's own words about her lost language and its significance to her as a writer about the Holocaust. What affects me the most, she wrote, is the continual sense of isolation that I feel as a survivor, an isolation enhanced by my being a Yiddish writer. I feel myself to be an anachronism, wandering across a page of history on which I do not belong. If writing is a lonely profession, then the Yiddish writer's loneliness has an added dimension. Her readership has perished. Her language has gone up with the smoke of the crematoria. She writes in a vacuum, almost without an audience, out of fidelity to a lost community whose language this was, as if to prove that Nazism did not succeed in extinguishing its last breath, that it is still alive. Creativity is a life-affirming activity. Lack of response to creativity and being condemned to write for the desk drawer is a stifling, destructive experience. Sandwiched between these two states of mind struggles the spirit of the Yiddish writer. Thank you.